Hi everyone, I'm Adam Young. I'm the editor of the Lubbock Avalanche-Journal and with the Amarillo Globe News, here to bring us a panel on preserving natural resources. I think that's very appropriate for a symposium on the future of rural Texas. You won't have a future in rural Texas without our natural resources and without those being managed and having thoughtful, deliberate conversations on that moving forward. So I'm really glad to have some leaders and great minds here with us. I'll introduce our guests. We've got Charles Perry. He's the Lubbock Republican State Senator serving Senate District 28. He was first elected in 2010 to represent Lubbock in the South Plains in the Texas House. In 2016, he was elected to represent the sprawling Senate District 28, which spreads from the southern panhandle to the Permian Basin, Big Country, Concho Valley, and down into the Hill Country. He's definitely seen miles and miles of Texas. I wrote that, I didn't land very well, but yeah. He's a Lubbock Republican and certified public accountant. In the Senate, he serves as chair of the Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee, as vice chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, and also serves on committees for education, finance, and transportation. Next, we have Marilu Hastings. Marilu is executive vice president of the Cynthia and George Mitchell Foundation in Austin. In addition, Marilu directs the foundation's Mitchell Innovation Lab, a varied portfolio of breakthrough sustainability ideas and opportunities that the foundation develops and incubates. Among her many titles and roles, Marilu serves as an appointed member of the National Petroleum Council at the U.S. Department of Energy and a member of the National Academy of Sciences Roundtable on Science and Technology for Sustainability. And then finally, we have Carlos Rubinstein. He is the principal member of RSAH20 LLC, an environmental consulting firm with a strong emphasis on water issues. He served as an expert witness on various environmental cases and has published several peer-reviewed articles on Texas water policy matters. He was appointed to the Texas Water Development Board by Governor Perry and served as chairman of that board from 2013 to 2015. During his tenure, he oversaw the implementation of the $2 billion State Water Infrastructure Fund. Rubinstein served as the commissioner of the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality from 2009 to 2013, and he was also a city manager in Brownsville, your hometown, for a number of years. So thank you all for joining me. So first of all, I was hoping to lead in with a topic that's, as we're in the midst of a drought here in West Texas, as we're undergoing, and really across a lot of the region. Perhaps we're faring better than some other places. I was looking at just the water data for Texas and seeing how our lakes fare. After the city of Lubbock invested hundreds of millions of dollars, we're fortunate to be able to tap into a lake, Lake Ellen Hendry, that's sitting pretty well, or pretty good at this time of year for being in the midst of a drought at 75% full. A lot of other lakes that, as the Texas Tribune has reported, are around 67, 68% going into the winter. But a lot of our, we're betting the farm on a lot of lakes and ground and surface water in the state. So far, I mean, as the Texas Tribune reported, there are some concerns that the Texas Water Board hasn't fully put its considered the implications of climate change into the state's water plan. So how should state leaders and other stakeholders factor in climate change projections when planning for the state's future water needs? Marilu, what are your thoughts?
So I agree totally with the senator that Texas does lead the country in water planning. The process is complicated and constant. But the Mitchell Foundation, we support work that makes climate change a more robust component of the state water planning process. The water planning right now uses the drought of record from the 50s, which most of you probably don't remember, but you probably remember the 2011 drought. They use those for planning purposes around drought and perhaps climate change. But what we don't plan for is that the drought of record of the 50s or the 2011 drought, which was a profound episodic drought. The 50s drought was more a decade long, but that's going to be normal. It's not going to be a drought. It's going to be our weather. It's going to be our climate. It's going to be constant. And we have not addressed the gap that is already profound without addressing climate change adequately. Think about the gap that we're going to have in water supply when we do start considering that the 2011 drought or the drought of record of the 50s is actually normal. And that's what the Mitchell Foundation supports, is more robust planning around that.
So this is an interesting topic because it's a question that when I was commissioner of TCEQ or chairman of the Water Development Board, I would get quite often. Here's a couple of things to consider. We are recognizing the impacts that are occurring because of changing weather patterns. The reality is the weather has been changing for a long, long time. What's causing it? That's where people will debate. I don't care to debate what's causing it. I'd rather talk about the impacts that are occurring. Here's a couple of things to consider. A lot of the water rights that we issued through time, we issued when we thought that that weather pattern was the norm. And it actually was because of the periodic things that impact our weather, mostly due with the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic more than anything else. It was an inordinately wet period, and we thought that that was the norm. And then we ended up, like Marilu said, with droughts, the drought of record in the 50s. Here's a shock. If you look at tree ring data from the 13 and 1500s, that drought doesn't hold a candle to the droughts that we had back then. So it's been much worse. What we do in planning, and we do have the model for the country in planning, we do not prohibit regions for planning on a drought that is worse than the drought of record. If you are running a municipality and you are trying to sell the investment that you need for the infrastructure in the future, people don't want to necessarily pay for the what if. They want to pay for the certainty. Well, the certainty is the drought of record. Now, there is no certainty, though, that we won't get another drought that is worse than that. The reason that the state modeling works to incorporate it is that we revisit our plan every 5 years. And if you want to talk about recognizing the impacts of a changing climate, go talk to the folks in Region N, Corpus Christi. After the 2011 drought, their models had to be recalibrated, and the assumptions of water availability that they were counting on were greatly reduced because of what 2011 taught us. We get to revisit this every 5 years. Having said everything that I just said, I will tell you, I believe in climate change, and it is something that it is occurring. And how it's going to impact us, that is what we really don't know. The models tell us what's going to be changing, but how it's going to impact us versus Nebraska, for example, it's not yet that clearly defined. We continue to work at it. Fortunately, we do have a process where we get to revisit it every 5 years.
Thank you. And so, after we had a brief discussion on this, I was wanting to follow up on a question with you. So what do you see, Carlos, as the shortcomings and solutions in addressing needs for facilitating access to natural resources like water or clean environments to rural and underprivileged communities?
Well, with underprivileged communities, one of the things that we have found, and people will be surprised to know how many million Americans, and I think it's over 8 million, that do not have, even today, access to first-time water and adequate wastewater services. And the reality is that we have Texans that don't have adequate access to first-time water and wastewater service. The state has done a tremendous job in putting up funding opportunities to alleviate those issues. The Economically Distressed Areas Program is one. There are opportunities today in advancing being able to accommodate these unmet needs in these communities. But what we're finding is, one, you might have land ownership dispute that prevents public capital from being able to be invested in areas where water is not yet available because it's all privately held. or the people that want to advance those strategies understand that they have a need, recognize that there is a huge problem, understand that water is their limiting factor, but they don't know how to navigate the process to get the funds. So the state has very attractive funding. The federal government is just infusing over the next 4 years now a huge amount of funding for water infrastructure. Being able to give those folks the technical assistance to navigate the programs to secure the funding, I think, will be critical. And, you know, we're all from Texas. We understand Friday night football. Sometimes when it comes to cooperation, we don't play together well. We're going to have to learn to play together a little bit better for regional solutions when it comes to underserved communities, and in particular, rural Texas.
And Marilu, if you have anything to add to that, or also, what challenge do you think the state's rapid growth has in accomplishing those goals?
Well, I second everything Carlos says. He's the expert. What I would add, there's two types of water natural resources. There's access to it through, does it come out of your tap or not? And is it clean when it does? But also access to water, bodies of water for aesthetic and recreational purposes. And we know that rural Texans and urban dwellers are underserved in access to open space, including bodies of water to recreate in. We know that educational outcomes are improved when children have access to green space. We know that health outcomes improve. We know that recidivism rates go down with prisoners when they have access to the outdoors, even through the windows that they construct prisons, so prisoners can't see out windows to green space. But their outcomes, their crime rates actually decrease if they could. Those have all been shown through scientific studies. So if underserved communities in the urban settings and in rural Texas, if we had more and equitable access to green space and bodies of water to recreate in, the outcomes in the state would be improved across all those different elements. What was the second part of your question?
Just concerns in facilitating that with the state's rapid growth.
Well, as we double to 50 million people by 2070, I mean, you don't need a lot of explanation. Texas loses more open space to development than any other state. Most of that development actually is for energy infrastructure. But obviously, you all see it here, even in Lubbock, Amarillo. We see it a lot, of course, in the Hill Country, all over the state, the housing and urban infrastructure. So, I mean, it's obvious. You double that, you lose even more open space, and you lose it faster, and there goes your parks, there goes your open space. Your bodies of water are, of course, already overtapped, and that.
Understood. And Senator Perry, in your role as a leader, what do you see as some ways, and what are some ways that you've worked on to help facilitate that?
Bottom line is we have to develop new supplies. We can move water from one area to another. When you move water from one area under the state law that allows it, and I'm not against it, it's private property, 101, you export the future of that community over to a different community. The economics and the development and future growth in that community stops when you move the water out of it. So to the point of playing well together in regionalization, I agree with that, but I would tell you, we have a finite source that we currently pull from, be it groundwater or be it surface water, and that's pretty much appropriated, to be truthful. Our surface water don't have any real more room in it to appropriate new water source. Here's the truth. We've got other water supply opportunities that we have ignored under the guise of it's too expensive. That label has to go away. Water's been way too cheap. It's going to cost more to develop new water supplies. And as we develop new water supplies, we alleviate the need to effectively take out or take away from some of the things that the Mitchell Foundation is concerned about, because we have another water supply that's probably not consuming land space. So in that role, 8,000 water supply systems across Texas. Most of those are rural community water supplies. There's some really large, obviously, But the small ones are the ones that need the most help when it comes to fixing leaky pipes. I have a $2 billion request next session to go in and start leveraging some money for those small rural connects to do that. We lose 143 billion gallons of water a year in leaky pipes. So that's the low-hanging fruit, right? If we get that. Now, that's a $190 billion price tag, I'm told. 60% of those pipes are over their estimated useful life, and some of them are environmentally not safe. I mean, we don't have lead pipe problem in Texas, but we do have other median that probably needs to be replaced. So that's the first leg. And then secondly, Texas has to get serious about pushing out the agenda to develop water supply. And I have a $1 billion ask for a fund that's a whole new thinking of water that will incentivize private sector, hopefully to go out to surroundings. Louisiana has promised us water forever. We just got to buy it. We have marine and desal opportunities. We just need to do it. We have brackish desal opportunities. We need to do it. We have a produced water opportunity that came up from last session's bill that I passed that is now ready for a pilot project. That's 14 million barrels of oil a day that on a low side recovery produces 250,000 acre feet a year. And the technology exists to do it. It's not really cost affordable, but when you run out of water, I always ask people how much was too much. And so we've got opportunities to do new supply, and we have to go down that road, and we need people in the state to stand up and say we need it, or we won't make the 270. The one thing that's going to limit the Texas miracle, the only thing that's going to limit it is access to water, plain and simple. We can fix everything else, but if we don't develop the water supplies today, it won't be here when we need it 20 years out.
And Carlos, it looks like you're wanting to weigh in.
Yeah, I appreciate the senator making the distinction on the playing well together. I did not mean to imply moving water from one area to the other. You know how I feel about that. What I meant by it is if you're a community, this table right here is a community, and you have your water pressure, your water challenges, and you have affordability as a concern and rate impacts as a concern, as you should. And that table over there is your nearby neighbor, and they have similar issues. Neither one wants to give up control over the water supply and their utility. But working together, that's where the working, being friendly towards each other, we could find regional solutions that actually lower costs for you, lower costs for that community, and regionally get to have a benefit. Didn't mean to imply moving water from one to the other.
Real quickly, the challenge on regionalization, and we've got funds that we intended to be very rural specific that to date have not been accessed. And the reason they haven't been accessed is because we haven't found an underwriter in the financial market to go, we'll loan money to community of 300 connections and trust that their tax base is going to pay us back. And so when we throw in the hub concept that there's multiple communities together, hopefully with an anchor, i.e. Lubbock, Texas, or somewhere that builds out of Cremall with Amarillo. That was a great partnership, and they bore the brunt of the financial end of that. We have not been able to partner a package on a financial level that gives the underwriter, the markets, the way to go out and say, I can tax you, you, and you, and you for this, and then getting communities to agree, because you always got the one-off community that says, we're good, no thank you, when really they're not, and trying to partner in that contiguously to make that geography work out for pipelines. So part of it's finance, but we've been having that conversation now for 4 to 6 years, and we're still, and the truth of the matter, it happens organically. We just opened up a reservoir over in East Texas, and there was, I think, 80 some odd rural communities that benefited directly from the reservoir coming online that were not, quote, originally part of the bigger plan. So it does happen sometimes, but we need to be more astute in pursuing the finance end of those.
And Marilu, maybe you can kind of help kick off this discussion. And wanted to ask about what do you see the role of higher education funding and research, and also private sector investment and investments in developing better ways to use our resources?
I'm probably not the best one to ask about that. The role of higher education. So, well, I can answer on behalf of the Mitchell Foundation. We fund a lot of research, and obviously in higher education and Department of Energy laboratories that are doing some of the best work on the science and applying the science to policy making and corporate decision making on natural resource management. And the one of the challenges that we try to address, and Carlos has been part of this too, is we fund research at universities, and there's a lot of great research going on. A lot of these challenges are sitting on some brilliant young engineer's laptop right now, but how to get that person funded, their work funded, published, and out into the community of decision makers, planners, policymakers, and then likewise, how to get that brilliant young person to know the questions that the policymakers and decision makers are asking. It is a constant, I think that's probably the hardest part of my job, is one, finding those young, brilliant people who already know the answers, and it's their future that they're looking at, and it's their future that they have to figure out, and how to get them paired up with people like Carlos and Senator Perry, who are asking questions and looking for answers to make the right decisions.
Senator Perry, maybe this is a good time
So,
to segue.
yeah, it's a great segue. Senate Bill 601 was the Produced Water Consortium bill that I passed that went down and built stakeholders in the oil and gas, the environmentalists, the water marketers, the midstream pipeline people. So for a year, Tech was oversight over that of herding those cats. 130-page report is out there for review. It's asking for a pilot project. So we tapped Tech to be the kind of the air traffic controller on those conversations to bring people. So that's where, and there's other consortium kind of like that on a national level, kind of housed out of A&M that's in the same produced water study. So we're tapping those. I will give you one other highlight. Part of the desal conversation is it costs too much because the energy is too expensive. It takes a lot of energy to push things through membranes, heat them for distillery, those kind of things. There is a permit for a nuclear research reactor, the first one that's probably going to be led in over 50 years in this country at Abilene Christian University. It's supposed to happen in the next 12 months. It's a fourth generation. It takes all the safety concerns and kind of alleviates most of those. It can be the energy production that we've been looking for to put behind a desal initiative. If it's successful, and we believe it is, it's a $200 million ask next session at the Texas. It's a game changer. It also takes the spent rods. Most people don't realize this. If they say that nuclear rod is spent and not usable, it's supposed to have been stored at Yucca Mountain, but it's not. It's 95% of the uranium still exists in that. They think they can take the uranium from that spent rod and use it in the nuclear reactor. So we are on the verge of cracking some energy barriers that if we were able to do that, this desal conversation takes a completely different look. And so lots of good things to work. I say that because you got ACU along with UT, along with, I think, Georgia and a couple of other university systems that have been intricately involved in that physics conversation. Rick Perry, Department of Energy, started it, transferred to the current administration, and they're still excited about it, and they have promised a permit possibly within the next 12 months. So possibly we could be cracking the biggest nut of our desal, which is probably our biggest water supply opportunity we have.
Carlos, I'll get to you next, but Senator Perry, you mentioned the ACU project. Full disclosure, I'm from Abilene originally. My mom would kill me if I didn't ask a follow-up question on this. She's been getting some notices about that particular project. Is it safe?
So
It's going to be near
without
your
getting
house.
into weeds, and I'm a frustrated physicist, I was a double E engineer and I ended up as a CPA. So that tells you about the third physics class or computer class, I decided it wasn't for me. I think you had to make above a 20. Something weird about that. That technology, my understanding, was around in the 60s. They have evolved fourth generation. The thing that makes it distinct is as you see these flumes of steam on these nuclear reactors, that's steam and a byproduct. There is no flume. It's a controlled loop that's a solid material, meaning it's a molten salt is what they describe it. But it would be like me taking a pot of clay and putting it here, and if it has an event, it didn't leave that space. It can't go anywhere. And so they believe it to be safe. That's what the proof of concept is, right? A lot of people start killing these initiatives before they even give them a chance. This was one that's merited for all kinds of reasons. It's clean, number one. It's in perpetuity, number two. And it's safe based on all the physics and science of 50 years say that it is. So I'm excited about it. And it truly, if it breaks out of its container, it's kind of like a Russian doll. It's nested. It's got so many layers, but it doesn't have a steam component or a distilled into the atmosphere component to it that the traditional models do.
Understood. Thank you, and I hope my mom appreciates an accountant's perspective on this. And then, Carlos, do you have anything you want to add? Not on the ACU thing, but
Yeah, I'm glad you're able to
higher
go home. I'm
education.
glad you're able to go home now. So you hear what Marilu has said and the senator, and that tells you that we're making great advances when it comes to water and highly technical efficiencies that are going to be created, and that's going to require people. So that's where I want to go to next, the role of academia. Normally, we don't worry about, look, I grew up in Brownsville and we had our fair share of hurricanes and floods, and all of us suffered from the last winter storm where we didn't have water and we didn't have wastewater operation. And that's probably the only time that you worry about who's operating that plant, right? Well, the reality is we don't pay these folks a lot. And there's a lot of competition of, I am going to take your operator and I'm going to pay him $1 more an hour. And then you're going to have a workforce problem. And with the new technology that's coming, we have to develop those skill set in workforce development as well. I was at a conference a week ago where somebody said, gee, you don't go to your mom when you're growing up and say, gee, mom, when I grow up, I want to be a wastewater plant operator. But God, do we need them? And so that's where I think academia is going to be playing a big role as well, and should.
Thank you. And in about 5 minutes, we'll ask for members of our audience to come up and ask some questions. Just giving a little shout out there. Just to kind of circle back on one other question that perhaps my mom would probably also be wanting me to ask. We had in the news a few days earlier this week an earthquake out in our region, really more in the Permian Basin, this 5.3, 5.4 magnitude earthquake. I know the Railroad Commission's announced that's triggered some mechanisms where they're sending some investigators out to see what they need to do and what they need to pursue there. Senator, I know we were visiting a little bit about this earlier, about some legislation that you championed last year and that has an impact on that.
Yeah, so basically it's saltwater injection wells, and those are around 15,000 foot deep, and it's just a whole lot of forced pressure of the produced water that comes up with the barrel of oil that I'm talking about. If we can find an alternative use, a beneficial use that we can tap into, you would not need to inject that well, right? So the Senate Bill 601, the Produced Water Consortium, is an answer to, I think, 50% of the injection well issue today, if we can tap that and make it work. So we're working on it. That injection well itself, they have kind of curtailed permitting in Texas. You know, Oklahoma had a complete shutdown for a few years, rightfully so, till they figured out where that was at. Texas has been really restrictive on how many more saltwater permits are getting out there, and I don't like this particular aspect, but they kind of moved a little more shallower than 15. To me, you're just moving it closer to a water supply down the road, but it's not that close to be sure. It's still 8,000 or 10,000 feet underneath the water supply table. But still, it just makes sense, right? If you keep pressure building down there and you keep hitting it hard enough over time, you're going to cause a move. So they're responding to the best they can. I want to find a reason we don't need to inject. I think that's where the Produced Water Consortium and things like that have a real viable political and practical application of providing supply and keep us from having to inject that much. And just remind yourself, if you get the produced water right, we've got oceans of water at 15,000 feet that we have put back down there that if oil and gas price is $30 a barrel, it might actually be economically viable for turning into a water developer. So we'll just see where that goes, but I'm kind of excited. So that's what you got to do, and that's just the world we live in oil and gas production.
Understood. And Marilu, I don't know if you have any thoughts from industry perspective on that.
I can't speak for the industry. So 5.3 quake, that was the strongest earthquake we've had in the state. It's not a heavily populated area, so there doesn't seem to be any injuries or damage from it. But it has gotten the Railroad Commission's attention, as these things do. I agree that it's caused by produced water. There's some misunderstanding. People who are not supportive of so-called fracking activities usually blame these things on the fracking activities, which is different. It's busting up rock to get the oil and gas out. Those are actually very rare, but by far, 90% of these earthquakes are caused by putting the produced water back downhole. Right now, that's the cheapest thing to do with it. Transporting water elsewhere is the most expensive part of some of these field operations. And in the Delaware Basin and the Midland Basin, especially the Delaware, the ratio of water to actual energy production is huge. So a colleague of mine actually likes to say that operators in the Permian are actually water developers with a high value byproduct. What to do with produced water is probably their biggest challenge after finding the resource itself. I agree the Texas Tech report on the Produced Water Consortium was an important first step, and that report qualifies the work that needs to continue going on, the science to ensure that this produced water, which is nasty stuff, is safely managed. The safest thing to do and the cheapest thing to do right now is put it back downhole, but these seismic events are happening more and more. But the volumes of water, like the senator said, are just huge, unimaginably huge amount of water. So to the extent that that's going to take decades to do, to make it safe and affordable for these companies, seismicity is going to continue because the only thing to do with this water is put it back in the ground.
Thank you. And Carlos, any thoughts on that before we go to our first questions?
A couple of things. If y'all haven't had an opportunity to read the report that the senator referenced, y'all should. It is very credible and it's very forward-thinking, and it provides us a path of sitting on what we know, but testing for what we don't know, so that we know that we have a safe utilization for this water. Here's the way I look at it. We started with climate change with your first question, I believe. We know that in Texas, our existing supplies of water are declining. We are continuing to mine water at rates greater than recharge, wherever recharge is occurring. And we know that in our surface waters, the reservoirs continue to silt up because that's what reservoirs do. And so we're going to have 50 million Texans here in the next couple of decades. We're going to have to find new sources of water. One good way to meet that gap is to reduce the demand on those existing sources by creating beneficial use for other sources of water that right now are not in the mix. That's all I'll add.
Thank you. Now we'll go to our audience for some questions. I guess that gentleman over here on my left. I guess could you start by saying your name and where you're from?
Excuse me, I'm Skylar White. I'm from Goldsmith, a little old town out there by Odessa. In this little magazine, it's on everybody's table on page 56. There's a high-level overview of the orphan well problem in Texas. Currently, the Railroad Commission has 8,000 wells on their list of orphans. The actual number is much higher than that. Each and every one of these wells has the potential to pollute a lot of groundwater, and a lot of them actively are. I've got two questions. In this coming legislative session, is there any will by the legislature to light a fire under the Railroad Commission and give them the money to get this count to where it needs to be, and that is 0? And the other question is, I want to ask Mr. Perry this, on the P13 wells, will you support reclassifying those P13 wells and putting them back under the purview of the Railroad Commission so we can get those plugged?
So a couple of things come to it. First of all, we funded extra money the last 3 sessions for sure. And I'm not sure that we didn't even choose some ARPA money, but I'm not for sure on that. So the Railroad Commission is getting more money. It's a resource, right? You got to have people to actually go out and deploy the money. So to your point, and actually the feds just gave the state of Texas a large chunk of money for well plugging. And so we got a lot of money coming through now. What we didn't do is really, in my mind, engage that money or employ that money the best. There are private vendors, Halliburton, Schlumberger, those guys that have come to Texas and said, we will take care of your well problem, but we want to do it on a large scale. We don't want a 100 well field over here, move our equipment to this field over there. It's not economically feasible. So what I'm going to be pushing for is to take the additional monies that are coming, fed and state, If we need to put more in, we'll have some more to do that. But deploy those those private sector contractors, that's what they do, so we can deploy a bigger personnel force to attack the well plugging problem. It exists, it's there, it's part of it, it should be done. Should never gotten this problem. Let's remind everybody, those are old operator wells that were left orphaned that had an operator responsible for it. In the Texas, we did not enforce that, or we did not have people to make sure that happened. I've had conversations about bonding on those operators, and I've gotten some pushback for legitimately so that it probably wouldn't help the problem. But we are going to deploy more money, and I'm going to push for alternative workforce people to deal with that. As far as reclassification goes, I'm not technically sophisticated enough to tell you that I know if it's a carbon well or a water well, and that really does change jurisdictions as to what's going on underneath that ground and what created that well. We are hopefully going to provide clarity to the TCEQ or to the Railroad Commission of whose job it is to do that well in statute. But right now that clarity does not exist, and it's not something I'm technically savvy enough to tell you I can do that.
Thank you. Anybody else want to add to that?
I like that answer.
All right, now that gentleman here on the right, can you
Yes,
say
thank
where you're from and your name?
Thank you. I'm Ken Curley. I'm representing Texas Agricultural Land Trust today. I appreciate y'all's comments about how Texas is growing at the rate of 1,000 people a day, and that water being a concern. About 95% of Texas is private owned, and our rainfall falls on that 95% of Texas and provides the water for everybody else. Texas Agricultural Land Trust's mission in part is to protect our wide open spaces and that legacy of wide open spaces that landowners enjoy and that is attracting people to Texas in the first place. Senator Perry, I appreciate your work on that Committee of Agriculture and Water and Rural Affairs. I know you've had some exposure to conservation easements. That's a great tool for protecting that legacy, protecting land, working lands from development so they can remain available for farming or ranching or recreation or wildlife habitat. Do you see in the coming session interest in increasing funding for those efforts in Texas?
So to your point, in that water acquisition fund that I'm talking about, the whole new concept of acquiring more water and developing more water supplies, be it contiguous states or on a national conversation that maybe pulls water around, conservation land easements will be a specified part of that, because if you take land out of production from a development or somewhat, you do actually create a way you're not using as much water going forward. So yeah, it's a vital part. We haven't funded a lot of money there in the past. I will tell you, as a tax deduction, you get a pretty good deal if you put it under the right vehicle. So there's benefits to it. I will tell you on that we are taking a lot of properties out of production, and our food supply becomes a conversation, right? We might end up being dependent on people that don't like us for our food supply if we're not monitoring that. But to your point, yes, it should be a vital part of that water acquisition, because it does develop kind of a new supply by not using existing supply.
Thank you. And sir, can you say your name and where you're from?
Yeah, Bill Pisetsky from here in Lubbock. My question may be slightly beyond the topic that we're talking today, but it falls under environment and climate change. Over the past 30 years of R&D, we've seen development and brought forward of electrical powered cars, buses, and trucks, and they're on the road today. In the past 20 years, some of the major manufacturers of farm equipment have also looked into powering the devices by electrical means. A few years ago, I think it was John Deere came forward with a harvester that was electrical powered and brought in a focus group to evaluate it, and everybody was impressed. West Texas cotton farmer said, "Boy, I love it, but I'm 5 or 6 miles from the nearest power line. I can't get a recharge on that device if you bring it forward, if it becomes practical and economical." My question is, can the legislature start now, ahead of time, looking at a new rural electrification program, and in case these vehicles do become practical, to grant subsidies or grants at one-time investment to provide the extension of these lines, since for the individual farmer, it's prohibitive to extend the current power lines 4 or 5 miles to where they're needed.
I'll take it. I'm probably going to step on toes, not meaning to. We're a long ways off from the electric vehicle model being a commercially viable alternative, specifically in the agriculture environment. Right now, the Volvo truck's got a 4,000-pound more weight limit on it that tears up roads quicker. It's a 75-mile out and a 75-mile back if you don't put too many cows on it. we got a long ways to go. There's another argument to this side. If you really look at the evolution of batteries and the destruction of the environment that it takes to get there, that's a whole different conversation nobody wants to have. To your point, there's been federal dollars given to TxDOT through some of these new monies, and part of that is putting stations in place. I don't see large geography that we cover out here, especially from an agriculture, having a viable electric source anytime soon. And when we do, it's got a lot of hurdles to jump through. We will have charging stations, I think, across this state. I think in the next few years, you're going to see them pop up. I see them now driving back and forth to Austin. But from a commercial viable in that industry specific, I don't see how you get there from here.
Marilu, would you like to weigh in on that too?
I'll respond. No offense taken. So transmission lines, you don't just put them anywhere, but when you do put them out in rural areas, they go through somebody's private property through eminent domain. So I don't know how to address rural electric vehicle charging. There is a lot of money for charging stations, but I don't know that they would put them out in rural far west Texas or something, or the Panhandle. They'll put them along highways where the most people go. I do agree with the senator. He might be surprised. We don't do work at the Mitchell Foundation on vehicles or transportation. It is 30% of carbon emissions, so it's a significant issue. But I agree that the carbon emissions produced by mining the minerals to create batteries, lithium, cobalt is my favorite example. It's mined in the Congo by 12-year-old Congolese boys who die doing it. They're the ones that are strong enough yet small enough to do the mining. It is horrible activity that is run rampant right now to make batteries so that people can drive their $200,000 Teslas and feel good about it. But they're mining the ocean floor, they're mining under the Salton Sea that some of my funding colleagues spent tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to try and protect and bring back. Now they're mining lithium underneath it. So no, in our opinion, electric vehicles are not the answer. I wouldn't build another charging station if I was in control.
I know the clock's out, but I appreciate that, and I appreciate the honest assessment. And we do have a lot more in common, I think. And she's from West Texas too.
I am from Midland.
She is from Midland,
And
so
my
she
dad
is
went
one
to
of
Tech.
us. I will say this back to the grid conversation: we're 10,000 megawatts short today, and we're in 1,000 people a state, and we're plugging people and things into it every day. I do have a grid bill initiative that hopefully will jumpstart thermal and other reliables and nuclear conversations that we're having. That nuclear deal in Abilene, 5 years proof of concept, they say commercially viable probably within 10. We'll see where it goes. But all that to say is our grid's not ready for that stuff, to be honest.
I know we're running short on time. I know we've had one other person here waiting for a question, unless I get told to stop. Ma'am, could you tell me what your name is and where you're from?
The question is, why has conservation of water not been part of this discussion at all? And we do it in the water plan, but it's only recently been encouraged that we spend any time on it or spend any funding on it.
I'll start with that if you don't mind, Senator. Great question. Thank you for asking it. And I'm going to expand your question about to include also reuse. Look, folks, you've been hearing us talk for an hour about where we are on water and how we have declining supplies and we need to build new supplies. The absolute cheapest water we can get is the water we already have. There you go. See, I got a thumbs up. I'm good. And so one of the things that is really driving the discussion now is up until 2013, we had planned, and we had planned, and we had planned. The legislature took the initiative of then saying, we can't just plan, we have to implement. They created the fund, the SWIFT, which I was honored to be able to stand up when I was at the Water Development Board. It gives preferential treatment for projects that advance conservation and reuse. So if you go back and you look at the 2012 State Water Plan, and we update it every 5 years, and you look at it and the 2021 plan, conservation and reuse has skyrocketed. Why? Because before, when we planned for conservation, we didn't ask anybody to cost it out. Now we do. Now people are realizing, this is the cheapest alternative. Let's be honest, conservation is not going to solve all our problems, but we have got to start with conservation and reuse.
Senate Bill 905 put a plan that is a statewide map on how you do reuse in municipals. Prior to that, every municipal was on their own to go to get a private start and try to figure all that out. So, and obviously, in the agriculture community, they're the best stewards and the best conservation people we have. They're not going to waste something they have to have for their viability. So there is conservation. And the reason I didn't speak to that is, as Carlos just said, that will not solve the 1,000 people showing up. And so we've got to have a broader conversation and realize it's going to cost more money. But shame on us. We have the money, the wealth, and the ability to address future water supplies if we make that a commitment to do it.
Carlos, Marilu, Charles, thank you for your time. Did you want to add anything else on that? If anybody else has any questions out there, I'm sure our guests would be willing to visit with you a little bit afterwards. We're going to go into a quick break now. We'll resume with our last panel on economic development with my good friend Sarah Wolf-Walberg hosting that one here shortly. Thank you all.